This exhibition, Elemental, showcases 5 of Ana Mendieta's film works from an archive of about over 100 films. And so even though this is only a fragment of Ana's extensive film archive, it's a really big deal for us because we had initially only planned to show 2 of Ana's films on loan from the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. And this whole thing is made possible by Art Bridges. But it's because of Raquel that we were able to actually expand the show and show 3 more pieces. So the project of restoring all of these films, which took almost a decade, has digitized and restored a lot of these films. A lot of them were 8mm. They were in shoeboxes. There was damage to them, and they spent a lot of time to digitize and restore these films, and that makes them available for venues like us to show them. Because as you can imagine, a Super 8mm film, it's very difficult to exhibit. Each time it runs through the projector, it's damaged a little bit more. And some of the early transfers to video, tape-based media were not all that great. So it's very difficult to see this work. And the first time I was introduced to Ana Mendieta was at the University of Iowa, where she is talked about frequently in the intermediate department. But you still didn't get to see her work in person. You saw a lot of reproductions. So this is a huge project, and I just want to plug the book, which I forgot to bring up here, but I'll show it to you later if you want to see it. It's called Covered in Time and History, the Films of Ana Mendieta, and it traveled with the show for 3 years. And it's an extensive filmography. It contains a full filmography of the films, and it also has some beautiful color images and essays by several authors, including one by Raquel. So if you get interested in the subject and really want to dive deep, that book is the place to go because it's the exhibition catalog as well. So all of that work that went into that is thanks to Raquel, and the fact that we are showing more of Ana's work here at City Art Space is thanks to Raquel. More people now can come face to face with Ana's work, and it has truly brought her work back to life. And so if you would, please help me welcome back to City Art Space, Raquel, Cecilia Mendieta.
Thank you.
So we're just kind of going off the cuff here tonight. Get us a rare opportunity to talk about just the films in this show, because we called this show Elemental, which is kind of a reference to the 4 elements. Ana was very prone to working with and in nature, and so it made sense to us to show at least 4 videos that kind of represent fire, earth, air, and water, and then the piece just kind of behind you here, the black and white, called Birth, which actually encompasses all the elements. But it's also really kind of an elemental introduction to Ana's work if you're not super familiar with her archive, because she's not just a film person. She was a sculptor. She engaged in performative action. She made photographs. She made paintings. She was a multimedia artist, and so it's so amazing to be surrounded by her work here, but to also know that it's only a fraction of the work. So we're going to kind of talk about each one of these pieces a little bit, just to give you some context. If you look around, all of the videos that you can see were made in Iowa, except for one. One was done in Cuba, which of course is where Ana was born. So we'll get to talk about that just a little bit, and then also maybe a little bit about the documentary Nature Inside, which was a short piece made by Raquel, but Raquel is currently now working on a feature-length documentary about Ana's life and career. So, but before we talk about the films, I thought maybe for those that didn't get to see your talk last night, you could just talk about how you came into this, because obviously you're Ana's niece, you have a unique perspective in all this, but it wasn't a given that you would be handling Ana's estate and handling the restoration project, which has taken up a lot of your years. So would you just give a quick summary of how you came to this project to start with?
Sure. Where do I begin? So, I mean, I grew up kind of as a teenager with Ana surrounding us, with my mother really taking on this work and on this mission to bring Ana's work into the world. And when we were really looking at her films and I was studying film, I was more interested in that part of it just because of my own interest in film. And as I learned more about filmmaking, my mother would come to me more to ask me, like, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And we're doing this with the films. So in 2001, she was taking the films and having them done, transferred by telecine process in a lab in Los Angeles. And we talked about that. And that was like really all you could do at that time with Super 8 films. I wasn't really involved the first transfers that she did. I just kind of knew she was doing it, and I kind of said, yeah, that makes sense, and would kind of look at what they were doing. And then when Olga Vizo was curating Anna's a really important retrospective that she did at the Hirshhorn, she wanted to do more films, and so they were going to go into the archive and like pull more films out. And so we did like there was a lot of talks about what was there another process available at that time, and should they be blowing up to 16 millimeter and so that's when they came to me, because I was getting my MFA at the time at UCLA, and I had already done a feature film that I had shot on Super 16 that was blown up to 35, and so I just knew a lot about the different types of formats. And after many discussions, we were like, no, we should just stick with what we're doing and just continue with the telecine transfers until maybe something will change. And so that's when I was involved with that, with overseeing that for that exhibition, like kind of helping with the telecine process and looking at the films and just basically putting titles on them. It was nothing really that complicated until Howard Duransky came, and that was in 2011. So when he came, he said, he was at the University of Minneapolis, and he's like, I want to do this film show, and I want to show like unseen works and things people don't really know, and I want to do a complete filmography. So we knew what that meant, that we were going to have to go and like actually look at everything and to be able to really do it properly. So, I mean, we didn't even know what we were getting into. We were just kind of like, okay, sure, that sounds great, And once we dove in, then it became apparent that it was going to be like a very heavily research archival project, because we had to go back to the beginning. And at that time, because of what was available in technology, we were able to scan everything to 2K. And that was like a trial and error as well, with like different labs in Los Angeles. Like we tried different places until we found the right place that had the specific machine that could handle like kind of this old film that was aged, and it had the sprockets that were shrunk and all that kind of stuff. So that's really how I really got involved with the film. Like I got into working with Anna's through the films, which makes sense because I'm a filmmaker, and just overseeing this whole thing. I mean, before that I was helping my mom with the estate, just because she had gotten ill, but I wasn't really doing that much as far as like with the works. It was more like I was looking at archives and things myself for my documentary and learning more about Anna and her work and her process. But this film show was really what made me like kind of really understand it and really dive into it. So that's basically how I came about it.
And as a result, like, we could show these films. They're exhibition copies that are relatively easy to show. So talking about the pieces that are from Iowa, we could start with those. In fact, we can sort of go chronologically. So Butterfly, which is the large projection back here, 1975. One of the few pieces that she's not out in nature, right? She's in a studio.
Yeah.
But it was a really sort of unique process at the time. A lot of other experimental filmmakers and video artists were playing with video studios and video synthesizers and things. Such evidence that Anna was getting her hands on anything and everything, and going beyond painting, obviously. Mm-hmm. So would you talk a little bit about this piece?
Sure.
And there's other iterations of it also, right?
Yes, and this piece, I mean, it's kind of like an anomaly, but it's a beautiful piece. The theme is very connected to her themes of transformation. And the interesting thing about this work is that it was done in 1975, because her other pieces that had to do with transformation as far as like birds and feathers were earlier. So they were done in like 74, and she kind of had left that behind and wasn't really doing that anymore. She was really deep into her Silhouette series when she came back to do Butterfly. But they had this machine in the university that they called it a quantizer, and it was just like a 16-channel piece of equipment that you could like run film through, and you could change all the dials and like affect the colors. And she did a piece called Source, It was basically she had a friend's wife was breastfeeding the baby, and it's just like an extreme close-up of her breast, and it was like she was like expressing the milk, and there's like milk coming out, and like she played with the values of the color, so it's kind of like bluish, and the milk comes out, it almost looks a little bit red, you know? So that's called Source. And then she did, and that was actually done on 16 millimeter. And then another piece she did is called Energy Charge, which was also done on 16 millimeter. And that one was done with, again, with the quantizer, where it's a tree of life. So what she did was she walked towards a tree, and then she kind of, as she meets the tree turns red. But because of the video quality of it, it's so hard to see her walking to the tree. You can kind of faintly see it. So it just looks like you're looking at this tree, and then suddenly this red silhouette appears against the base of it and then disappears. And that film was actually made on 16 millimeter, and all the effects were done in camera, because it's like we don't have any evidence of how she made that, and we tried to figure out how it was, and there was like nothing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but they used the quantizer to do that. Like they desaturated all the color, the values until it was just looked black and white, except for the red. And then the other piece she used the quantizer for was Butterfly, and so Butterfly was done. They actually shot it on Super 8 film, projecting it onto, like, filming the monitor. So the monitor was hooked up to the quantizer. So it's basically, it would have been a VHS camera shooting Ana. She was against like a backdrop, and she was standing there nude with these wings on. So the VHS camera is on her, and then the Super 8 camera was on the monitor, like this, the TV screen. And that's why you see the bars flickering like that, because, it was Super 8. And we had some conversations about, like, why would she choose Super 8 over 16, because the other two were 16, but it's because probably she shot more film, 16 millimeter costs more, because this is one reel, like one 3-minute reel, and we discovered another larger reel that has like 4 more pieces, so it was like a much longer thing. So this one's called Butterfly, and the other one's called Butterfly 2 or something, which we haven't mastered that one yet.
So very few pieces that she was doing, in the studio, like, and experimenting. And this was done in Iowa too,
this was done in Iowa. They had that equipment there, and like everybody was playing with it. She wasn't a student at the time, but I'm sure that everybody was talking about it, and she was like, "I want to play with that thing."
Yeah.
So she went in and did some pieces on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you talk about how Ana was about 4'11", not quite 5 foot tall, which I don't think we measured that, but that's about, I don't know, I'd say pretty close,
yeah, it
right?
does.
Of her actual life size, which I think is really amazing to see that piece that way, to know that was about how tall she actually was. So 1975, and then let's move over to the two pieces on the wall back here, because I think Silhouette de Arena is 78, and then Palomonte is 80, if I remember correctly. So these two are kind of in succession of what we're looking at in the gallery. Those are the next two pieces in chronological order. And the Silhouette series is obviously something that people who know Ana's work are very familiar with that series. But again, when I was introduced to this work, I saw still images, and to see them in motion, especially the gunpowder work on the right, where it's burning up in her image that's impressed into the ground. And then the De Arena, which is more of a relief type of sculpture that's out of the ground. So would you just talk about how she thought about those two ways of representing her body in the landscape?
Sure. Something's just hitting me as I'm sitting here looking at these pieces and talking about them. I didn't realize until right now that like all of these are kind of anomalies of her work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And then Birth is not. So it's like Birth is like the unification of all these different ideas. Just because Butterfly, like she didn't really do any other works like that, and also because her films at that time were really all about process. Like she was filming like the body, something was happening to the, like changing in the frame or the fire. But this one, it's like the process is happening in the film. Like nothing, she's just standing there, right? It's like the process is happening to her. Yeah. So that's how that one is different. Silhouette de Arena is different because that film is from 1978, and she has the arms up, but she had already taken the arms off on her Silhouette series. So, and I remember when we were doing the filmography and we looked at that work, we were like, why is this 1978? Like, we couldn't figure out why the arms were up, because you can really look at her body of work and kind of figure out the dates by like the type of form it was.
Yeah.
I feel like the reason why is probably she had basically had a wooden cutout of her shape. So she measured, because in the beginning when she first started doing her silhouette, she would lay on the ground and have somebody trace her form, and then every silhouette was her size. So it was 4'11", more or less, right? And then as she was working more, it was like if nobody could help her, she needed a way to do that, and she created this kind of like cutout, you know? So I wonder if like she had the cutout and she was like, you know what, I'm gonna do this island piece, I'm gonna just sacrifice my cutout into the, you know what I mean? Because the cutout has to be in the water there, and she built the sand on top of it.
Oh, I see.
Because there's no way it would have been that perfect unless the cutout was like at the base.
I see.
Just thinking like as an artist, like as a sculptor, like how would you build that?
Yeah.
Right?
So the template's underneath.
Right,
though,
so the template's underneath and then the sand is built on top.
Yeah.
But this piece is like what she would refer to as an island theme. So it's like kind of representing Cuba, like she is, like her homeland, herself is the kind of like one with her homeland.
Yeah.
I mean, I love her pieces with water. I think they're very beautiful.
Yeah, there's so many.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's another one where it's like nothing is happening, it's more happening to the subject in the film.
Which is, the Gunpowder Works is where there's really lots of action happening.
Yes. So
and talk about the gunpowder too, because she had to make her own.
Yeah,
right?
she made her own gunpowder. The first work she did with fire, she did a couple first works with fire that weren't quite what she wanted, and it was obvious that she wasn't able to like contain the fire. So she did a lot of research on that and talked to a friend of hers who was a professor who was working with fire, but then also her brother, my uncle, who was actually a Boy Scout. And he was like, oh, you can make gunpowder, and this is the recipe. And so she played with that, and she kind of created her own recipe where she played with the values of like the ingredients and added sugar in to kind of do certain things that it would slow down the burning. And it's very interesting when you watch a lot of her films with gunpowder to see how she does that. Some of them are black gunpowder, some of them are white, and then like how fast they burn. So this piece is more, towards the end, her shapes had become kind of more universal in form. Like it's obvious, like it's some kind of a human form. It has a heart in the middle, but it's not necessarily male, female. It's just human.
Yeah, and the arms aren't
and there's no arms, and so this is like the trajectory of like when you look at her silhouette is how they kind of evolve into more of the shape. And also what's interesting is by this time in 1980, she was building things that were more sculptural.
Mm-hmm.
So like at first they feel more flat and more close to the ground, and then as time went on, they kind of became, more like actual sculptures in the earth.
Yeah.
Also, what's interesting about that piece is you'll notice a lot of her Super 8 films later, like from like kind of late 70s into the 80s, she would like take the camera and like walk around and like zoom in and out and like play with all the different techniques of the film.
Arena
the
is very stationary. Like you're just watching
on a tripod, kind of.
Balamonte is the camera's doing a lot of moving.
Yeah, there's a lot of action.
Yeah. And then sort of continuing with Silhouette series, the Birth piece, but if I'm not mistaken, Birth and the Equestrian Sculptures piece, even though one's in Iowa and one's in Cuba, are made the same year. Is that right? 1981.
Yes. So the Palamonte was one of her last pieces she did in color.
Okay.
Because she transitioned in 1980 to only doing black and white.
Okay.
So she bought a Mamiya camera and she was printing things at a larger scale. And her films, all her last films are black and white. And I think it's just because she wanted to take out the color information to have it have that more, that presence of like feeling like this is a work, like let's not look at the color. I mean, I love color, so for me, I'm just like, okay, I get it, but like, can we go back to the color?
Yeah.
But I get it. I can understand what she was thinking with that.
Do you think she, just to interject a little bit about just kind of thinking about photography and the fact that during her time photography was still questionable as an art form, and she's thinking, if I go to black and white, maybe it's more timeless, maybe it'll be considered more as art outside of the,
Right.
yeah. Or I wonder if someone gave her advice.
I'm sure someone gave her advice, or I'm
Yeah.
sure it was things she was seeing at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, it could have been like a number of things that
Yeah.
was making her go to that. But I mean, I think also, like when she printed the Rupestrian sculptures, they're all in like large, like they're really large black and white prints.
Right.
And they do feel like more epic. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like when you look at them, you feel like you're looking at like a sculpture in 3D, like coming at you. And if they were in color, I mean, of course it was rock and whatever, but they're just such beautiful images and like more like beautiful, you know.
Yeah.
It's a kind of detracts from like the graphic forms of them.
Yeah.
The shapes.
And we, just to give you, since you're here, we get the inside information. We were only going to show 4, and then I did a FaceTime walkthrough with Raquel, looking at the space, and we were like, you know what, we need one more piece. We need to put 2 here and 1 here, and the reason we chose birth is because it seems to have all the elements in it. It's got earth, it's got fire, it's got water, and air. Is that the only one like that, you think? I mean, because we were trying to figure out what would be appropriate.
It might be the only one that has water that's like that.
Yeah.
I mean, she did those at the edge of Dead Tree area, that they called it. It was like an area that had all dead trees. It doesn't exist anymore. I think they built a parking lot or who knows. But she loved doing works there on this bank in this muddy creek. And it's interesting because she actually did several pieces the same day. And she shot it also on some kind of video. I don't know I'm trying to remember what the format was. If it was like, it wasn't half-inch. What's the other video? I mean, it had to have been, but it wasn't half-inch. It was like Porta-Pack or this one of these crappy video things. And there's audio on it.
Oh.
And so I was listening with headphones and trying to listen to see, and you could hear like all this random talking. Like there was other people with her. There was like some guy, and somebody had another camera, and they were like talking about how many rolls of film did you shoot, and like she was like, oh, I got to get this one, and da 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 da. And then Hans was obviously there, and he was saying something. And she's like, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to come into the house with these clothes on. I'm going to burn them when we're done. Because they must have been like destroyed
Just
with like
totally,
mud and fire and like whatever on them.
That's great.
Yeah.
So do you think, was this birth piece before she went back to Cuba? Even though it's the same year,
I think so. I have to look at the filmography because it's a bit, but I'm pretty sure that because she did a lot of ideas before, you know, she would like, when you look at them in order, it's very interesting. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like Silhouette de Reina, you're like, huh? Like, I don't get how that one sticks in there. But some of them are really clearly influencing the next ones to come.
Yeah.
And when you see the shapes and then you see the things that she did in Cuba, it's like it all kind of clicks in.
And when she went back to Cuba, that was the first time she had been since...
When she did those works, it was the second time.
Okay.
So she went the first time, and that was just like her reunion with the family. She got to see a lot of different areas in Cuba, and she actually scouted out some locations and talked to some other people about, you know, saying, I want to do work here.
Yeah. So how long was it between those two?
It was a year.
Okay. Okay, and then talk a little bit about the Rupestrian sculptures, because they're similar in the fact that it utilizes the figure in the landscape, but it's very different than the Silhouette series.
It is very different. She actually did similar works in Mexico.
Yeah.
So the first trip that Ana went to Mexico and she started doing her works there, she went every summer except for I think one summer, and went back and just did work. So she pretty much was doing her work Iowa, Mexico, Iowa, Mexico, Iowa, Mexico, until she went to Cuba. So it's kind of like once she went to Cuba, she didn't go back to Mexico anymore. So the summer before she went to Cuba, she went to Mexico, and she did a series of carvings in like the bank side of a dirt kind of cliff, and they're very similar kind of shapes. First she did it in Iowa, and then she did it in Mexico. So it's interesting because you're seeing she was like trying out these ideas of like building these kind of shapes and forms on the sides, like in dirt though. Yeah. And then she filmed them all with Super 8 and then took individual photographs of everything. So when she went back to Cuba, she was pretty much doing the same thing, but in like limestone in 2 different sites.
Yeah.
But the shapes kind of, they seem more mature. You know, like when you really look at those works, it's like, there was something about them that was just very, like ancient, you know, like these forms were just like so, I mean, it was like female, but not female. And when you look at them in relation to the Mexico ones or the Iowa one, they're just, it's like almost like a whole nother inspiration struck her.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that's the scale of time she wanted to speak to in the work. Like she wanted to speak in almost like in an ancestral way to find her past, but she's also leaving remnants for future generations to see.
Yeah, and she talks about that. She liked that idea. She liked the idea of like somebody stumbling across and not knowing, like.
Yeah, what is this thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to talk a little bit about when you went down there to find those pieces again, and about your journey to kind of go back and discover these pieces and how you discover them, because we were talking at lunch today about some people that said, oh, they're destroyed, they're not there anymore. But because you've been working on the films for so long and the documentation, you could recognize the landscape when it lined up just right. Yeah. And that happened in Cuba and it also happened in Iowa, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So because I was doing the restoration project and looking at the films and the photographs, the slides and everything, on the first time that I went to Haruko, like everyone knew there was this one site that existed and there'd been documentation of that there was this place where you could go and see like a couple of the works that still existed. So we went, and when we were leaving, I turned and I saw this huge, like, you can see it in the opening of that film, actually. You see like kind of the cliff. And I just stopped. I mean, it was completely like overgrown. It didn't look, you know what I mean? It looked but there was just something about the shape. I was like, And that's kind of what drew me in. But it took 2 years for me to go back and really dive in there to see, you know. But I mean, it was almost like she left kind of like clues in that film. Because the thing that's very interesting about that film, it's one of her last films, is that is really a movie. You know, it's like she actually shot several rolls of Super 8 film, and she chose the shots and she edited them together, and they're not like, the way she edited them together is telling a story, because it's not actually how the location is at all. She was kind of like, here's my establishing shot, here's like getting in closer, here's these works, and here's these other, you know, and you're trying to figure out like where it is, but you really can't unless you go there, and then you're like, I get what she did.
Yeah.
You know, so it to me is really interesting as a filmmaker to look at that film, because, you know, the fact that she actually did it on her own, that she just was like, no, I want people to have the experience of like, here's the location, now we're going to go in and discover these works. In a way, it's almost like Silueta de Laberinto, which is the one where she's in Mexico and she kind of is in this ancient site and she's like going around until she finds the Silueta. You know, but that doesn't have any edits in it.
It's just like a continuous shot, one shot.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like, thinking about the format of how these works are shown versus a film screening where we're sitting in a theater and watching them. And also considering like when you're restoring and digitizing these, you're trying to get it to the original authenticity of the way Ana created it and the way it should have been seen, right?
Yeah.
And that was the whole challenge with restoring these, is to get back to that original flavor, if you will. But showing them in the gallery like this as separate pieces, right, that just loop continuously and they exist in a almost window shopping format where you can stop and look at it, move to the next one and come back to it, versus watching them in a theater. And really the nature of her work being not definable, like, because she seemed to experiment with all different ways of splicing things together, or shooting things all in one shot, or and also thinking about these, is this the artwork or is it a documentation of the artwork? There's just a lot of gray area in how she was using moving image, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what you think she was thinking through some of that.
I mean, I feel like these are the works. I mean, because the works don't exist anymore.
Right.
So, I mean, she was very aware of that. I mean, she knew, I mean, that was the time period that artists working the way she was, that they used photography or film to document whatever their work was. But she was kind of like ahead of her time in that she was thinking, I'm not just documenting a performance, because she even said they weren't performances. She called them actions. She's like, this is a sculpture. She's like, well, they're not really sculptures, they're acts. But she was kind of like, it's a sculpture, like I'm the body as sculpture, you know? So she was thinking like, this is the work. Like, you want to see my work? Here, watch this film. And she, like in interviews I've listened to, like she talks about that kind of thing, because the work doesn't exist. So for her, it was more just sharing her work with people. It wasn't necessarily there was no rules like how to share it. It was more just the sharing of it.
Right.
So for me, like coming in, I really felt like I wanted to stay as true to the medium as possible. Of course, we're always pushing that a little bit just because you can. But as far as like having it look, when you shoot film and you get it back from the lab that first time and it looks amazing and the color is so vibrant and it's like unaffected by having gone through the projector a million times and being all messed up,
Yeah.
So like that was my wish, like to have it look like that. And I feel like we achieved that for the most part, And as far as like size, I mean, to me, it wasn't about how small or how big it can be. I mean, sometimes, yeah, it could be too big, but I mean, we've shown some of these so big, just like we were at Art Basel one year in Miami and they were doing projections on a building and I was nervous, like, how's this going to look, and it looked amazing, it was just like, okay, it's cool,
Well, and that too, I think, is the advantage of the digital format and having them in that portable. It's more portable, and she was shooting in Super 8, which is a very portable format, but, having a range of size of, in the guidelines for exhibiting these works is like no smaller than this, no bigger than this, gives you some flexibility. So you can respond to a space in a certain way and let it inhabit a space as it should instead of being very rigid about it. But you also talked about seeing it in a theater and like having everyone,
Yes, it's a very different experience.
Yeah.
Just because, when you're in a gallery space, you can just kind of walk by and not stop or whatever, and you're seeing so many at the same time. But when you're in a theater, it's one at a time. And you're sitting, and it's kind of like this dialogue between you and whatever's happening on the screen. And I mean, just like going to the movies, it's a very different experience, and it's very powerful.
Yeah.
Like I really enjoyed it, and I think she would have as well, just because it's like look at the work. You cannot look away, and it's like you're there, and it's like looking at it, and
Yeah. Was she a fan of cinema?
Oh yes, yes. She loved cinema. She loved going to the movies. Yeah. She was like very into pop culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, she liked like popular music and like, all that. I mean, she grew up in Iowa,
Well,
like in the, you know what I mean? Like she was like very into all that.
Yeah. I want to open it. If you guys have anything on your mind, please chime in. I'd love to extend the conversation out. Tate, do you have something?
Along the lines of cinema and what she liked, do you know what they were collectively like looking at? Was there a micro cinema activity there that with Hans Breger and what films were coming in that would have this almost because it's in the middle of Iowa and that intermediate scene was so in a vacuum in a little bit of a way in the middle of the country. What kind of inputs were they?
Yeah, I mean, Hans was bringing in everybody and everything that they could. I mean, whatever was available to see, they would see. So, I mean, at that time, I mean, they were very educated, and knowing what was happening in the New York art scene and around the world, and not just from like whatever publications were happening, but also bringing artists in and artists who were showing their work. So, I mean, everything. I mean, they had Godard there. They had
So all the dematerialization stuff that was happening at that time with like these earthworks and et cetera, that was still part of the dialogue.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the Bijou Theater was there in Iowa, right? When she was there, or was it not?
I don't know. I don't
that was
remember.
like the little art house theater.
I
in
think
Iowa
so.
City.
Yeah. When I was doing some research and I was looking at the different types of screenings that were there, it was like
I feel
really
like the Bijou,
amazing.
Yeah, it was like had a long history of being like the art house theater in Iowa City, and I feel like I read that was a thing when she was there.
I mean, there's just like anything that had to do with the arts, or just like it was all being talked about and being looked at and discussed. And she was very into that. She was like one of the artists who was always like reading and knowing what other people were doing and kind of creating this dialogue with that. So.
And it's a very interesting environment, Iowa City, because because it's like podunk with a whole bunch of smart people in it.
Right.
And it is a bubble because you drive to the west or the east or north or south, and it's very rural, cornfields and farmland. But when you're in that environment, it's very much like this small town full of artists and thinkers and philosophers, and you're on this river, and it's just a very interesting place to kind of be. And it's just amazing to me that, not by choice, but Ana and your mom, her sister, end up there and grow up, and that becomes
Yeah.
a major part of her whole history and her whole oeuvre of work.
And the fact that she chose to stay there that long
Yeah.
and create all these works, I mean, she really came to know herself not only as a person but as an artist before she made the decision to move to New York City, you know? And it's like she actually talked about that in one of her interviews with somebody, how, you know, before she moved to New York, she wasn't really thinking about her work as far as like marketplace.
Yeah.
Like she was just creating the work, you know, and then at a certain point she was like thinking about, oh, how do I enter the marketplace and what does that mean? And
Yeah.
it was kind of like a shift. And you can even see that in her work, you know, when she does come to New York and when she is starting to try and find gallery representation, talking to other people. And
Yeah, because, you know, talking about, we're not sure if this is film, we're not sure if it's video art, we're not sure if it's sculpture, and I'm sure if you're trying to get into the New York art scene and sell things, you know, gallerists are like, what am I selling? And photography was still not really something that would...
if you weren't doing painting or sculpture then,
Yeah.
and you were a woman, forget it. I mean,
Yeah, right.
I mean, even then, it's still forget it. So
Yeah.
it's like,
So she's starting to think about, I need to make objects that I can sell, and we were talking about this the other night, like, she surely would have been successful at that and have done that, but then if she established a practice where she could sell objects, I'm sure she would have returned to more ephemeral art making, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Anybody have a thought or question they want to throw out really quick? Yeah.
In your documentary, there's a scene where she's laying down, and then it flashes, and it's red in the imprint. Did she splice that? Like
Yes.
that? Okay, and then what is that red? Do you know if it's...
It was paint. So when she first started working, she was using actual animal blood, and then it was obviously not ideal. And plus, it's like even when she did like some of those works with the blood, it was like it wasn't painting the way she wanted it to, and so she moved quickly to tempera paint, you know, and just like kind of trying to match that color into something that was a medium that kind of mimicked it, but that,
Yeah. Let's talk about your documentary a little bit and just kind of the process, and also let's kind of center that on Ana as a person, right? Like who she was as a person, because people that talk about her is like she's very ambitious, she's very forceful in the way she thinks, but she was also very gentle and giving in many ways, and you have to kind of, you know, you're related to her, but you also have to kind of think of a way to how to present her in a documentary setting. And you were talking earlier about how you kind of chose to present her. Would you talk about that and why you chose, or why you're choosing at this point to kind of represent her as a person in a certain way?
well, with this film, I really wanted her to speak for herself, because I just felt like there had been many years where, you know, we were talking for her, the gallery, or like different academics or different curators, and this kind of like her voice was getting lost a little bit. And there was a lot of emphasis on like her performative works and her works with blood. And I just really wanted to shift that narrative back to what she felt was her main practice, which was working with nature. Yeah. And her goal, like, just kind of like to show her work having like this more universal connection, really. And if you look at her readings, like what she wrote about her work, and that's basically how this piece came about. And that's why I called it Nature Inside, because it's all about her connecting with the land and her like trying to search for like her place and like search for home.
Yeah, she talks about how the paintings, she was making these kind of icons, and it wasn't enough for her. She needed more magic, you know, and that's really what film gave her, was to animate and to be able to record.
Well, they're very alive, you know,
Yeah.
film is alive, and I think that's why she liked it too, because it's like you feel things happening in it versus like a photograph is capturing a moment, but it's still, you know. So I think that's really why she was attracted to the film, for those works that have to do with process.
By the way, this piece is obviously silent right now because we're having a gallery talk. We're going to turn the volume back up, and you can hear Ana narrating, and it's from a talk she did at Alfred University. And she's talking about, you know, how the paintings weren't enough for her, and she needed to go into nature and start making these pieces, and sort of interweaved with some of these different silhouettes, including some of the ones that are in the show. And it's so great to like hear her voice when you're kind of walking around the space. But now that you're working on a feature length, because you made a couple of other shorts for different sort of niche moments of her career. And I heard you say in another podcast, you're like, I keep finding people to interview, and I keep finding people who knew her or who had experiences with her, and the footage and the collecting just keeps going. And I'm sure that's a daunting task.
It is. I mean, it's to capture an artist who had so many different mediums is challenging in itself, but also like, I mean, all humans are complicated, but Ana was just like, had so many different sides to her, and like her life, there was just, even though it was such a short life really, it was just like, there's so many different things to explore. I mean, I feel like I'm done interviewing people who knew her, and now it's more about getting other types of voices to talk about the work or to talk about the importance of the work. And really just bringing everything together, and like that last kind of look at the archives or look at whatever we can find to bring it all together. And I'm at that point where I'm like, let's go. You know?
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Just want to give you an opportunity if you have it. If not, I kind of want to talk about how, because a lot of people will talk about Ana being a female artist, and we talked about this earlier a little bit today. And of course, she was in a male-dominated art world, especially in the 1970s. And so people will often refer to her as a feminist artist, or someone who represents a feminist energy. But she didn't see herself quite that way. I mean, we were talking about how she really kind of was a contradiction in some ways, because she wanted to be with women. I mean, the AIR gallery, she wanted to support that, but she also felt still like an outsider and didn't quite get on the bandwagon of feminism in the way that some people like to assign to her today. So I just wondered if you'd address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when she first moved to New York, she had met several of these artists who were in AIR and who were considered themselves feminist artists. And I think she felt like, oh, this is my way into the art world. Yeah. You know, like, I'll belong to this collective, this group of women, and we'll all support each other and like make our way into the art world. And she did make friends with several of them, but like as time went on, it's like she just didn't feel like quite like she belonged in there, because it was mostly white women, and she didn't really see them as feminists. I mean, I'm not sure what she meant by that, but she talked about like how they weren't really feminists. I don't know if it's like, I know some of them were like married and had kids, but I don't know like what she was referring to when she was saying that they weren't quite. Maybe it's just because they were like still like kind of really seeing themselves as under the patriarchy. You know, it's like she was very thinking ahead. Yeah. Like even like with her work and like the ideas that she had like about herself when she talked about it, like, I'm an artist first. I'm a woman. Like, yes, I'm a woman, but I'm an artist. Like, I may show something a certain way because I am a woman. That's my experience, and I don't know any other experience. But it's like, why do I have to defend that or talk about that when like you're not asking like a male artist that? Like, so are you making male work? Like, how is your work like influenced by your experiences as a man? You know, it's like nobody's asking that. So as a woman, it's like automatically goes to that, and she's like, what the hell is this? This is bullshit. You know, like. So she was like really pushing the boundaries of that, and people were scared of that at that time. You know, and she curated a show at AIR called The Dialectics of Isolation that was basically about that. It was about women who were artists who were working outside of that. And it was like, she basically had this amazing intro to the catalog where she says, you know, we are other. Like, we will continue to be other. It's kind of like, we're not going to fit into your little box here of what you want us to be. You know, we are who we are, and this is, you know, we're other. Yeah. Deal with it.
Yeah, I think there was a comment earlier today, which in the class that we visited, it's like she was really one of the first third wave feminists because of the intersectional qualities that she brought, like Madonna and Cindy Sherman, of representing yourself and contradicting yourself and kind of being confusing visually. And she's like doing that before we even named it what it was. Yeah.
If she would have been around, she would have been like, oh, yeah, like, you know.
Yeah. She might have found.
Or maybe she would have found another one.
I mean, it's kind of the things, feminisms of the third wave. Okay. Anything else? Oh, yeah, over here.
As you go through her body of work and you start to get a feel of the things that she cared about, that she enjoyed, are you finding any hidden themes that, you know, were maybe perhaps overlooked, you know, as you delve deeper and deeper into her art?
I mean, the themes really, I feel like the tree of life and the island and displacement, I mean, there are things that she talked about. I mean, it's not, I mean, I don't really see anything, I mean, I don't know how to really look at it, I guess, looking for that. So I'm just, I basically like read what she's written about stuff, and then I look at the work and I kind of go, oh, I see what she's talking about with this, and I kind of see how she writes different, like she would write a statement about her work, and then you would look at this body of work related to that time period, and then another statement that has some of the same stuff in it, but a little bit different. So as she's growing as an artist and as her work is growing, she would kind of change the statement. It would grow and grow, and it went from very personal and very biographical to like very universal. To like the last thing was like a poem almost that was just like relating like herself to like the cosmos and like nature and the earth and so her ideas like went from like me to like everything, finding that connection. And the thing that's interesting is just looking at the work and seeing that even in the early works. It's like looking at that thread that it was always there, but it's like she was just figuring out a way how to express it.
Yeah, and there's an exhibition card I encourage all of you to take that has a quote from Ana on the back, which is about like really the more poetic talk about universal energy and ancestral communication. And we're kind of jaded to that kind of language today, but when you look at Ana's work and hear say it, it's authentic. Like that's she really was embedded in that kind of thinking, magical thinking. Yeah.
So kind of as a follow-up question, just looking at the history of like Cuba as a country, is there any like political activist themes in her work? Like was she talking at all about Fidel and what was going on in the island at the time, or not really?
No.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting. She wasn't. I mean, personally, she was not really involved. I mean, her father was a political prisoner and she'd been sent away. When she moved to New York, she fell in with like this group of like very leftist thinking artists, and she herself like kind of joined this socialist way of thinking. But for her, it was more like everyone should be equal, like art should be for everyone. I mean, that was always her belief anyway, so it kind of fit with the way she thought. But she was very idealist with it, and she thought like, oh, this is amazing, like utopia, and when she first went to Cuba, those first trips, she was like embracing it and thinking like, oh, this all makes sense. But then after several trips, the last trip she actually took to Cuba, it was like the awareness, and she had met several Cuban artists during those years, and they were telling her like the realities of like how artists were treated and how like gay people were treated and just how women were treated, and then like kind of like those rose-colored glasses shattered, and she had her own experiences, and she was like, no, I'm done, like I can't come back here anymore.
Even though her work really never addressed it specifically, she did take kind of an activist role, right? I mean, she did try to broker relationships between Cuba and the United States and was successful. Yeah, she was bringing artists from New York to Cuba, and like Lucy Lepard and like Jane Cortez and Mel Edwards and like just different people like kind of trying to bridge, this New York scene to the artists in Cuba so that they could learn, because in Cuba they had no access to anything. Like she would bring them catalogs and be like, here, look at, Art Forum or whatever. So she wanted to teach them and to help them, and she was very invested in that. Anyway, just like even like here, like she's going to universities and teaching, graduate students. But she kind of kept it behind the scenes. It was a different kind of work for her. Yeah, it was like what she did. It's like the way she lived her life, but it wasn't in her work. Yeah. Yeah. Which is why I think her work still stands. It doesn't feel so dated. Yeah. Like some of the artists working that time who were like really putting what was happening in that time in the work, it just feels kind of like, oh, this is like 1970 whatever, or. Yeah. Yeah, John.
Two things. One, I know someone who just retired as a member from Art Gallery, so I understand the whole thing, and it's probably what she did. But nonetheless, when you talk about kind of preserving the film and getting the film back, and you're seeing the colors, and you can't always be sure that those are the colors that were actually original. But it reminds me kind of of Emily Dickinson's story in that, the first books that were published and the first publishings of her work, they went in and put periods and commas and corrected all of the. So I wonder, like, what is the weight of the legacy body to kind of carry that legacy along? And are you kind of in that alone, let's say, or is there more of a support around kind of containing the legacy? Because like you said, there's people who want to kind of show this body or make this body work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's always like when I came into this and my mom was like, the important thing is always, we always say like, what would Ana do? Like, what would Jesus do? Like, what would Ana do? You know, so we were always going back to that and like going to the archives and trying to find what she wrote about something or said about something, or looking at the specific work to see how she presented it, or, you know, but then also knowing that she also was interested in change and in technology and making sure the work stayed alive. Like with these Super 8 films, when she moved to New York, she was transferring these to 3/4 inch and making 1/2 inch dubs so that she could be showing these. And she was in several exhibitions with Filmworks where she like put 4 films together on a VHS and like had it screening at, you know, 112 Green Street or whatever. So it wasn't for her, she wasn't like a, what's the word when the person's like a film snob, or, you know, I know there's a word for it, I'm not thinking of it right now, but yeah, but, you know, she wasn't, you know, to her it was the work, you know, it was like show the work. It wasn't like, oh, this has to be Super 8 with a projector, and, you know, she actually said the opposite. She said that Super 8 was a drag, you know, because what she meant was like, who has a film projector, yeah. And then it breaks and then it rips your film, and, you know, she was like, just show the video of it, you know, yeah. Like, so I mean, it's always like go back to her, and it's become like, it's pretty much me, but it's like my mom is very still involved. Like if I'm questioning something, I'll go to her and she'll give me like some gold nugget of like, remember, and I'm like, oh yes, thank you, you know. And then the gallery is very involved too, and we have a dialogue where we'll discuss things and talk about it, and, you know, so it's a process.
There's a big show coming up, mm-hmm. right? And they're going to show some of Ana's paintings.
Yes, it's very exciting. So we're having not a retrospective, it's an exhibition that's starting in Montpellier in France next summer. And the curators were going into the archive and just trying to decide what they were going to show. And we always like to say, look at everything. Yeah. And I said, you know what, show them the paintings. Yeah. Just, you know, why not? Let's see. And they loved them. And they're like, we're going to put some of these paintings in. So I'm very excited because it's the first time that her paintings are going to be shown in an exhibition, like ever, since she was alive. And it's going to travel to Spain in October. So I just feel like it's an important part of seeing her work, like, you know, to have her being an artist where she is now, and to look at that first work, so you can actually see the full circle of it, is really fascinating. Yeah. So. Well,
I think, you know, without you and stewarding all of this, we wouldn't be able to do that. And it's hard to wrap your head around her entire body of work. And so these iterations and making these films available and just getting more people exposed to her work, I think, is half the battle. So I just want to thank you again for all the work you did there, but also in helping bringing it here to City Art Space. It's truly been an honor to show Ana's work like this and have you here over the last couple of days. Let's give another hand to Raquel.
And thank you for doing such a beautiful show.
Oh, thank
you know, I walked in, I was like, this is amazing. You did a great job.
No,
so thank
great
you.